Greetings and salutations, friends. So, the Imperial Army. Now, in the last episode I gave you a general understanding, I hope, of how they might fight. Now, in Total War terms, they will fight much like what we are used to from your average human factions, because, well, duh, they're humans. But, of course, the Empire being modeled on a Renaissance faction, something we haven't really seen in a Total War game. I mean, we've gotten close. Medieval Total War has toyed with a Renaissance faction, so to say, but it hasn't really gone all the way. So they are going to handle slightly differently, and of course the added fact that they have super artillery and, mages makes them slightly different to your average Holy Roman Empire of Medieval 2, for example. Now, as usual, we will start out with the heroes, starting with the Lord-level characters of the General of the Empire. Now, the General has a very good attack for a human, and has really good leadership. So he's a pretty damn good general, but he is just a human. You are somewhat lacking in his specialization abilities. Because you could make a hardcore combat hero out of him, you mount him on a griffin, for example. You give him some magical doodads, magical lance perhaps, and a magical shield to keep him alive, maybe some magical armor, etc. And you could have a pretty powerful melee hero out of it, but while relatively powerful in melee combat, he's never going to be able to stand up to proper melee heroes, Chaos Champions, or Black Orc war bosses, that kind of stuff. He will give a Skaven Warlord a serious run for his money, but he's not guaranteed to win even there, so I prefer to employ them as powerful leadership units. However, if again, as we hope, that Total War will actually implement a proper character system, and by the way, I have been getting quite a few questions of exactly what I mean by a proper character system, and while I have explained it in previous videos, I figured I'm going to make a video on my views on that, just so I have something to link to people, which is just easier instead of just directing them to a tiny part of some video where I ramble on for 5 minutes. So, if you're curious about my general thoughts about that, I'll summarize it in a video that'll be coming quite shortly, so do not fret. So, back to the point. In Total War terms, the General of the Empire should first and foremost be your good old-fashioned leader. Now, you should be able to specialize him a bit, like you could have him just be the leader of a knightly order, which is technically another hero within the Empire, but here I'm going to kind of assume that, let's say you start out with a general, yeah? You start out with a general. As he gains experience, you can level him into a Templar Grand Master, which is essentially a slightly more melee-centric general. He's a very prominent member of a knightly order. You could level him into an Archlector of Sigma, for example. Essentially, he joined the church and he rose through the ranks, and that is a level up, so to say. It's not strictly correct in fluff terms, but it would be a little bit more interesting, because then you could have him be a melee general with the advantage of a few spells, or miracles, as the Cult of Sigma likes to call them, because, if it comes from God, it's not magic, it's miracles, and all of that loveliness. He could even level up into a wizard, for example. Again, very much so non-fluff, but it could be cool in a Total War sense. So I would kind of like for the 3 Lord-level characters of the Empire, which is a General of the Empire, a Templar Grand Master, and an Archlector of Sigma, to not be individual generals, so to say. Well, of course they will be individual generals. I'm not talking about some kind of monstrous hive mind general here, although that would be cool to see. Now, I'm talking of them as upgrades, so you always start out with the General of the Empire, and you can either keep leveling him up to a much better General of the Empire, so, he's just becomes better at his job, or you can side grade him to, for example, like I said, a Templar Grandmaster, which makes him a hell of a lot better at fighting. He still retains a pretty damn high leadership, but now you have a bunch of potential combat traits that you can give him. Or you can sidegrade him to an Arch-Elector of Sigmar, which gives him a little bit more of a magical feel to him. Or even a Wizard Lord, which takes away a fair bit of his leadership, because, he has other things to concentrate on when he's throwing fireballs, rather than, sounding good and inspiring his troops. But, of course, he gains access to all kinds of cool magical spells. Could be interesting. I do hope they give it a little bit more of an effort than just the normal character system in a game like Warhammer, where there are so many heroes. But my foolish dreams aside, let's move on. We have the Captain of the Empire. This is just your basic hero, so to say. He's not necessarily a noble, unlike the General, which is almost always a noble, although you can climb to the rank of General within the Empire while being lowborn. It's pretty damn close to impossible. It doesn't happen often, let's just say. So your average mudblood will probably only rise to the rank of captain. Now, that doesn't mean that the captains aren't valuable members of the Empire Army. In fact, the captain is one of the few characters that is allowed to use one of the special things about the Empire Army. He can be your battle standard bearer. He can be given a magical standard, which doesn't just have effects on the unit, but could have effects in an AoE around him, and could even affect the entire army. Now, again, since I haven't even begun to think about how Creative Assembly are going to implement magical items, and all of the potential things they could do with that, I'm not going to go too deeply into that. That's probably something I'm going to explore when I'm done with all of my factions videos and just go really into detail, because there's just such an absolute insane amount of magical items that's probably going to have to be a weird video in and of itself. Other than that, the Captain of the Empire could be a family tree, so he could be a character that you use, and that could be pretty interesting. But I would rather see him as a recruitable character, so to say, with his own upgrades and side grades, rather than allow him to become a full general. Or, if you're gonna allow him to be a full general, it's going to require a ridiculous amount of experience, because, like I said, captains very rarely actually rise to generalship unless they are of noble birth, and if they are of noble birth, well, they're either going to be a captain only in name, and kept pretty damn far away from the fighting, as a battle standard bearer, or he's only going to be a captain for about a week before being promoted, noble stuff. But if he is a recruitable character, you could give him all kinds of cool equipment, which could allow you to boost the combat capabilities of many of your normal units. Maybe you could give them some special abilities, make them immune to fear, for example. If you wanted to go a little bit further, you could give them extra leadership, you could make them very hard to break. Maybe some magical effects, like, for example, this unit inspires fear, stuff like that. All kinds of cool things you could do. Something a little bit more basic, the next hero is the Warrior Priest of Sigmar. Now, much like the Arch-Lector of Sigmar, the Warrior Priest is essentially a mage, as he has access to, miracles, again, but he is considerably more fighty than your average wizard, having been raised as a warrior. Well, it's the clue's in the name, isn't it? Warrior Priest of Sigmar. Also, he is of course a batshit insane religious fanatic, which has some rather tasty benefits, as any unit he joins gains the Hatred special rule. Now, what this means in tabletop is essentially that you get to re-roll attacks that miss, Essentially, the soldiers have been worked up into a religious frenzy and are just absolutely crazy mad at the people they are fighting. They hate them, they proper hate them, and they're attacking them with all kinds of ferocious intent. In tabletop, I think this would be pretty cool if you could do this as a magical effect where they actually reroll attacks to hit, because, technically the tabletop and the Total War version don't work all that differently. You essentially have percentage and dice rolls in the background. used by the engine to actually calculate whether a unit is going to hit, whether it's going to actually damage the unit they're attacking, etc, etc. So I'd kind of like that. If not, they could just simply illustrate it with a bonus to attack, for example. Relatively simple. And he would have access to a bunch of miracles. For example, one particular prayer, quote-unquote, that he can bless his unit with in tabletop is that they give a chance to reroll wounds. So, first, of course, you have to hit the guy you're trying to attack, then you have to wound him, then you gotta check if his armor gets in the way and stops you from actually, causing the wound. And again, you could kind of do this just in the background in a Total War game. Alternatively, you could simply give them increased accuracy, instead of weapon damage, you give them extra attack. Not too problematic. But again, the warrior priests have so many special abilities like that if you allow them to be easily recruitable, you could quickly break the game. Simply because if you put one of these bastards in every single unit you have, suddenly you have an Empire army that is just absolutely batshit insane good at melee and all kinds of shit, with all kinds of crazy stuff like ward saves, rerolls to wound, rerolls to hits, all manners of insanity. And so I think the Warrior Priests of Sigmar should not be recruitable, even as a hero. I would like for them to be granted to you by the church. For example, you get a classical Total War style mission. These heretics needs to be purged, la-ba-di-la-ba-di-la, and you go off and you attack the little village or city or whatever, and you complete the mission. And as a reward, the Church of Sigmar gives you, for example, 5 warrior priests, which you can then put into your armies. So they should be relatively rare, and they should be given to you mostly through special events, completing missions. And I would also really like that, let's say that you control the Empire as a single entity, rather than the individual provinces. But I would still like for there to be factions within the Empire that you do not directly control. For example, the Colleges of Magic, and the Warrior Priests, or the Cult of Sigmar. And you could conduct diplomacy with these factions. You can ask them, could you give me some wizard? Can you give me some wizards of this type? Could you give me some warrior priests? Can you give me X amounts? And could I buy you some? Like, could I give you 1,000 crowns for example, a warrior priest? Could be interesting, and it would be a pretty good way of limiting the amount of these very powerful characters. Now, of course, if you level up one of your generals of the Empire into an Archlector of Sigmar, which is essentially a bigger, badder warrior priest, then okay. We shouldn't be limiting that too much. That should be limited purely by the fact that you're going to have a limited amount of family members. Whew. Okay, this is going to be a rambly video, isn't it? I'm sorry about that. It's just, I have so many cool little ideas about the Empire that I'll try to control myself a little bit so that this doesn't end up being a 2-hour video or something crazy like that. So, let's try to move on. We have the Battle Wizard, which is exactly what it sounds like. He's a Battle Wizard. Again, should be somewhat limited. Maybe you can recruit them from the Colleges of Magic, or maybe they could be recruitable, although they should be ridiculously expensive. And you should have a fairly expensive, fairly high-tech building to do it. Like, the Colleges of Magic produces quite a few wizards, but very few in actual military sense, They produce maybe a dozen wizards total over the course of a year, so it's not really something you can just keep recruiting. So either some kind of limit per army, or a diplomacy solution, or maybe a max amount of recruitable wizards per turn or something, plus a fairly insane price tag, could work. And then for something a little bit different, you have the Witch Hunter. Now, the Witch Hunters of Sigmar are essentially an Inquisition, a Spanish Inquisition within the Empire, rooting out unlicensed magic users, witches, and chaos worshippers. Essentially the secret police force of the Empire. And as they are used to dealing with unlicensed magic users, chaos worshippers, and all manners of horribleness, they're pretty good in a fight. However, in a battle sense, they are available to you in the tabletop, and personally I don't really agree to them being available at the tabletop at all, because witch hunters are independent, extremely independent. A general can't just call upon a witch hunter. You know, they have essentially limitless amounts of authority. They go where they do. They go wherever they want to go, they do whatever they want to do. So, personally, I'd kinda like for them to just skip this guy entirely, because they're such a rare unit that they shouldn't really be available. Like, okay, cool, maybe you could have a mission structure where this place has become a nest of heretics, blah blah blah, go cleanse it. Okay, you get a couple witch hunters, and in Total War terms, they're essentially the same as captains. You can put them in units, they're just really, really damn good at fighting, and they give the unit they're attached to a little bit of magical resistance. Could work, but otherwise they should be insanely rare. I would prefer to see them as agents, you know, as assassins, for example, or spies, you know, doing what they actually do within the Empire, rooting out chaos heretics and going after unlicensed magic users, that kind of stuff. Last of the heroes, we have the Master Engineer. Now, this guy is not so much a combat unit, although you could actually kinda use him for that. He's usually attached to artillery crew. He's essentially, well, an engineer. He's damn good at what he does. And they should be relatively rare, because, you know, the College of Engineers have few enough teachers as it is, so they don't really like to watch their brilliant minds wander off to the battlefield where there's every possibility that said brilliant mind is going to be scattered across the grassland. But they're a hell of a lot quicker and easier to train than wizards, so they should be relatively easily available, because they have a lot of cool stuff, and I am a firm believer in that cool stuff should always be implemented. A Master Engineer is so much more than just a dude that hangs around in your artillery park and rerolls misfires, or gives a slight damage boost, that kind of stuff. That's not all he does. Of course, he does do these things. He could give your battery of great cannons bonus attack against walls. Maybe he could give them bonus range. Maybe if it's raining, and they would usually be receiving all kinds of negatives to firing, maybe he could nullify that stuff. You know, cool stuff with your artillery. However, he also has access to a lot of other cool little gadgets that makes him more interesting in, for example, a unit of handgunners. He has access to a special long rifle, which uses extremely prototype-level rifled bullets and long, intricately engineered scopes that gives him a bit of a sniper role. Or you could give him a grenade-launching blunderbuss and put him in a combat unit and have him basically be a little grenade lobber. And I have to mention, you might remember from the Empire lore video, the homing pigeons with the bombs? Yeah, the Master Engineer can use those too. Although, again, while they might work, they might also, you know, return to whoever sent them out flying, so hazardous weapon to be sure. And probably somewhat problematic to implement in a Total War game, though it would be a pretty awesome sight to just watch tons of pigeons were carrying bombs flapping towards the enemy army. So, in a Total War sense, you could of course implement him as an artillery dude, like I said, or you could give him some cool things, like you could give him the sniper rifle and have him be an individual that you select within a unit of handgunners. And normally he fires extremely slowly because that rifle takes a hell of a lot of reloading and a hell of a lot of careful reloading. But he pretty much always hits. But even then, he's gonna kill, what, 20, 30, 40, 50 dudes over the course of an entire battle, you know? He's not gonna make that much of an impact. However, give him the ability to snipe, and you can target individual characters within the enemy army. Now, that could of course be incredibly infuriating for whoever plays against you, just having this crazy little bastard snipe off all of your characters, so it shouldn't be an instant one-hit kill. It should be essentially an ability that is a guaranteed hit, because, sniper should be a guaranteed hit, otherwise who would bother taking that kind of risk, but it shouldn't kill the character. It should just put him on very, very low health, forcing your opponent to go like, ah, crap, now what do I do? He's not dead, of course, I could just save him, or I could risk it and send him in with the unit as usual. A little bit of cause and effect. Of course, such an ability should have a ridiculously long cooldown, precisely because if you're just allowed to kill the enemy dude's champions and special characters, he's gonna be pretty pissy with you pretty damn quickly. So, that's it for the heroes. Moving on to the core units, we have the state troops. Now, the state troops are the provincial professional soldiers of whatever province they belong to. And while they are relatively uniform between the provinces, there are provinces that do things differently. For example, the spearmen of Ostland are usually quite heavily protected, often given full plate mail, because they are the backbone of the army. They are the core of the Ostland army. They are their big, beautiful line of spearmen that holds back the beastmen. But that would only really come into play if they're doing the provincial system. If you can play as the individual provinces, then of course you should have that province unique type of state trooper. But for the moment, just to make it a little bit simpler, we're going to go with the idea that the Empire is going to be played as a single nation, and therefore have uniformed units of state troops with maybe some hero units here and there. For example, you could have the Ostland Spearmen, but you can only have 3 of them, for example, So, state troops. State troops are your basic, trained, disciplined soldier. They are very solid troops, and they make up for what they lack in strength and ferocity compared to, orcs and chaos and the other horrible, monstrous species of the world, with tactics. So while in tabletop terms, a human has a strength of 3, which is the same as an orc, and you might then go like, but that can't be right, an orc's way stronger than a human. Yes, if a human was going to fight solo against an orc, the human would probably be something like strength 2, technically, while the orc would remain strength 3. However, that's not how the humans fight. They fight in relatively disciplined blocks of troops, so that strength 3 is more of a reflection of the individual trooper within the unit rather than, the trooper just by himself. He is made stronger by his peers, you could say. And this kind of individual unit tactic and formation fighting is what allows humans to actually fight against the more monstrous species of the Warhammer world. And so, while all state troopers are essentially the same, disciplined, organized, professional soldiers, they have access to a wide variety of weaponry. First up is the workhorse of the Imperial Army, the halberd. Now, the halberd is a two-handed weapon, and so it impairs the wearer's ability to use a shield. He can have a shield that is essentially strapped to his arm, but that's not going to give him as much protection as a proper shield that you're wielding properly, However, the big upside of the halberd is that it gives 1+ strength to the wielder. Now, this is really important, because the guy holding the halberd is often going to be fighting stuff that's considerably tougher than your average human. He might be fighting ogres, he might be fighting chaos warriors, he might be fighting all kinds of monstrosities, and that plus strength that would be represented in total war terms by a +2 weapon damage is really quite vital to allow your basic humans to deal with things that are most definitively not basic humans. And while the lack of a shield is of course going to make them quite vulnerable to missile fire, halberdiers really should be a vital part of any Imperial army. simply because they can deal with big, bad, nasty stuff a lot better than most of the other units. Also, I would really like them to be given a spear wall ability. Now, for those of you who are familiar with Total War, the spear wall is the basic spear wall that you, for example, see in Medieval 2, where the front rank kneels, presents its spears braced against the foot, the second rank presents their spears past the first rank, and the third rank stands with their weapons above their heads, you know? For those of you who aren't familiar with this, it's essentially a formation where all the first 3 ranks present their weapons in such a way to allow all 3 ranks to fight. Now, in tabletop, halberdiers can only fight in 1 rank, while spears can fight in 2 ranks and pikes can fight in 3 ranks. But in Total War terms, I would really like for them to be able to fight in multiple ranks, simply because, being just basic humans, they're probably going to need a couple advantages, and it would be a really cool way to actually show the fact that these are disciplined, proper troops. They are trained, and they are capable of multi-rank fighting, because of their extreme skill at tactical combat at a unit-per-unit level. So I would really like to see that implemented. Next up, you can of course equip them with the good old-fashioned spear. Now, this is a unit that could technically be using the shield more effectively, seeing as most of the time you're going to be thrusting with the spear, rather than slashing and cutting like you would with a halberd. So they should have a slightly higher defense against ranged weapons than the halberd troops, but it should still be relatively small, because still, the shield is just strapped to your arm. You're able to cover yourself a little better, but not all that much. Again, the spearmen should have some kind of special formation that allows them to fight in at least 2 ranks, and be able to brace themselves against the charge. But otherwise, they should be basic spear units available in any Total War game. Then, of course, you can equip them with the good old sword. The swordsmen of the Empire are usually accorded a little bit of extra training, as they are considered a bit more of an elite formation within the Empire, because most state troops are expected to hold the line, so to say, and in such a respect, the good old halberd or the solid dependable spear are far superior weapons. The swordsmen are considered the offensive arm of the Empire. They're the attacking force that you send off to drive off the enemy after they've been halted by your lines of halberdiers and spearmen, and as such they have considerably higher weapon skill. Essentially, in Total War terms, they should be slightly better than normal state troopers. They should be better on the attack, good weapon damage, very good attack skill, and have a little bit higher morale, because, you know, they are considered elites and they consider themselves elites. I would kinda like to see them be given shield wall, for example, which gives them a bit of a defensive bonus, but at the same time, while they should probably have it because they would almost certainly be capable of doing it, they're not really a defensive unit, so I would kind of like to see them be given more of an offensive formation, like the offensive testudo of Rome Total War, for example, where they get a bonus to their attack as long as they stay in formation. That could be pretty interesting. Now, going from the melee-equipped state troopers, we have handgunners, which are equipped with, well, what should we compare these to? They're not muskets, and they're not quite on arquebuses. They are essentially basic flintlock weaponry, a little bit more advanced than your average arquebus, but not quite as advanced as a proper musket. They fire smoother shots, so there's no rifling here, so they're relatively inaccurate at long range. However, well, they're handguns. They have some of the biggest impact per projectile of any handheld ranged weapon. And this should quite simply be represented in Total War terms with an armor-piercing special role, and should otherwise work as your average musketry unit in Total Wargame. However, again, Empire troops are disciplined troops, so I would really like to see some kind of ranked fire thing here, where the first rank fires, kneels to reload, second rank fires, kneels to reload, third rank fires. Because the Empire State Troops would almost certainly be capable of something like that, and while it's not technically fluff doctrine, having a unit of handgunners in Total War terms only be able to fire their front ranks would probably make for a pretty lackluster unit, so I'd really like rank fire to be implemented with them. Then you have the ever-reliable crossbow. Now, the crossbow should also have armor-piercing damage, but considerably less than that of a handgun. But the crossbows are also considerably more accurate at long range. And again, I'd kinda like to see the crossbows be almost a handgunner unit. I'd like for them to be able to fire in ranks, but reload a lot quicker. What I would really love to see from the ranged units of the Empire is big differences in how they actually fire. So you have the handgunners, they fire by rank. First rank fires, kneels, reloads, etc. But the crossbowmen, I would love to see a rippling fire thing, a platoon fire, where the first 10 men of the unit fires, then the next 10 men fires, next 10 men fires, but they don't wait till everyone has fired. Once the first 10 men have reloaded, they fire again, and so on, and you have a ripple of fire traveling up and down the unit, giving the crossbowmen a much higher rate of fire than the handgunners, with less armor piercing, yes, but again, much higher rate of fire, with less volley damage, so to say, as at most, at any one time, there's probably only going to be 20 or 30 crossbowmen actually firing at the enemy, but you cause continuous damage to the unit, and it would make them a quite interesting unit alongside the handgunners. Now, the archers, because of course the state troopers have access to the humble and the always reliable bow. Now, if the handgunners are going to be rank firing and the crossbowmen are going to be ripple firing, the archers should be the only ones able to proper volley fire, where the entire unit of 120 men fires off all of their bows at once in a shower of missiles. And I really think these different flavors of firing would actually make it a bit more interesting to take the various units, rather than just for, taste or fluff reasons. Because if you like to be causing continuous damage, you take the crossbowmen. If you like tons of armor-piercing damage delivered over a short period of time, you take the handgunners. If you like to be able to volley fire at long ranges, but with much less damage, you take the archers, etc. It could add a little bit of cool interaction to your actual armies in a Total War game, and I would really love for them to implement that. Whether or not they will actually do it, well, I doubt it, because, well, to be honest, Total War has never been that much of an innovative genre, if you know what I mean. They've been kinda stuck in the basic formula now since Medieval 1, really, so, Anyways, man can hope, can't he? Now, all state troopers should come in units of 120, because they're disciplined professional soldiers. They shouldn't be coming in horde sizes of 240, and 120 should be a perfectly decent size for them. Then we've got an interesting little unit, which isn't technically a unit in and of itself. You have the Free Company Militia. Now, you might remember in my lore video that I said that most of the provinces employ a mix of professional state troops and militia. Well, the militia part is the Free Company. The Free Company have some basic choices in their equipment, but usually they come with 2 melee weapons and very little armor. And they are essentially used as detachments to their parent units of state troopers, meaning they would work much in the same way as Skaven weapon teams, in that you can't take a Free Company militia without actually having a unit of state troopers, so they're tied to the unit of state troops. Now, free company militia can be taken, like I said, with different weapons, or, well, in tabletops they're technically limited to 2 melee weapons, but I think you could do a lot of cool things with these guys. For example, attach a unit of Free Company Militia to a bunch of armors, and by the way, Free Company Militia should not be full units of 120, they should be 60, because they're not meant as frontline units, they're meant as supporting units. So, back to the point. Let's say you have a unit of archers, and attached to those archers are 60 Free Company Militia armed with spears, essentially easy to produce, ramshackable, peasant-level spears, pitchforks maybe even, which they can brace in a rudimentary fashion, which gives the archer units a nice, cool little protection against light cavalry units. Of course, a unit of heavy cavalry is going to just plow right through this unit and into the archers, not giving the faintest of shits, but they could definitely give a unit of light cavalry something to worry about. You see? A cool little unit that protects its parent unit. Or, in the front ranks, you could attach a unit of company militia to a unit of halberdiers. Now, you could give them 2 melee weapons and essentially use them as a flank guard kind of unit, or maybe you could give them 1 melee weapon and a javelin, allow them to throw a few javelins over the heads of their state trooper brethren into the enemy unit. Could be cool, would make them an interesting second rank unit. Or maybe you could give them slings and have them act as a skirmishing unit. They're put out in front of their parent unit in loose order, and they harass the enemy and eat up some missile damage, protecting the parent units behind them. There's a lot of really cool things you could actually do with a unit like the company militia. And again, really, the only limit here is imagination. You could do all kinds of awesome things with them. You could have them as slinger skirmishers at the front, you can have them as javelin support at the back, you can have them as flank guards, you can have them as basic guards against light cavalry for archer units, maybe you could even give them bows and just have them add a little bit of inaccurate support to their more proficient brethren. They're a really flexible unit that could be employed in so many interesting ways, so I would really hate to see them implemented as just a militia unit, Creative Assembly just makes them as a 120-man unit of just militia, kind of a peasant unit. That would disappoint me greatly, because it takes what could be such an interesting unit that could add such a cool dynamic to the Imperial Army and reduces it to just canned fodder that is pretty much never actually going to be built in any serious army, so I really hope they add them in as detachments rather than just a unit. Moving on, we have the last of the core units, the Knightly Orders, and yes, heavy knight cavalry is a core unit within the Empire Army. So having a full-on army of knights is perfectly feasible. Now, the knights come in essentially 2 flavors. You have the traditional knightly orders, which come with a shield and a lance, which gives them an extremely powerful charge, and also gives them the weapon damage to deal with large, ugly things like ogres, trolls, etc., because the lance imparts a +2 strength, which means that on the charge, their weapon damage should be considerably higher than normal, just to give them a good chance of actually doing proper damage to a nice big unit of monsters before getting stuck in to melee combat. And then you have the Knights of the White Wolf, with their 2-handed cavalry hammers. The Knights of the White Wolf have slightly less armor than the traditional knightly orders, because they've decided that helmets are for pussies, and just flat out don't use them. They also don't like shields, because, well, swinging that giant-ass hammer around takes a fair bit of upper body strength, and having a giant piece of plank plastered to your arm is probably going to hinder you pretty severely. Of course, the benefits are that while they lose their extra charge potential, these guys don't really need the charge potential because they have giant-ass hammers, and are probably the Empire's second best answer to large units of enemy monsters, simply because while an ogre is a big, strong, powerful brute, he is going to have some problems with a hammer planted between his eyes. And, of course, wielding giant-ass hammers, they're also pretty damn good against units in heavy armor. Now, as for the traditional knightly orders, they are equipped in remarkably fine plate mail, and since they also carry shields and ride fully barded war horses, these guys would be practically immune to archery. You're going to require something along the lines of a crossbow or a black powder weapon to be able to do much against these bastards. For the Knights of the White Wolf, this holds less true, simply because an arrow might not be able to penetrate his armor, but since he's not wearing a helmet, well, they might be tough, but an arrow through the eye socket will probably stop one of them pretty damn quickly. So, while the Knights of the White Wolf are going to require a fair bit more babysitting to keep them out of the range of various missile weapons, the standard knightly orders should be able to more or less soak up the vast majority of stuff that most armies can throw at them. Like, they're not going to give the faintest of shits about orc arrow boys, for example, because the very few arrows that are actually going to be hitting them are probably going to be plinking right off their solid armor-encased bodies. Now, as for a total wargame, now, since they are a core unit, I want you to be able to have entire armies of knights if you so choose. Of course, it's gonna be bloody expensive, because, well, they are still knights, and while it is possible to field an entire order of knights, it's going to be absolutely insano expensive, and the upkeep is going to be absolutely astronomical. But they shouldn't be limited. Now, in fluff, they are somewhat limited, because there are very few actual knightly orders, and they don't have that many members. However, they usually have lesser members or some other kind of fluff excuses for why you can have armies full of them. So I think they should be recruitable as a normal unit, but very expensive, and you should only be able to recruit one of them per turn. So it's going to take you a long time to actually get a full knightly order ready for war. Because, well, it's a knightly order. It's gonna take some time to actually mobilize all of these bastards. As for numbers, they should come in standard heavy cavalry sizes of about 60 models, and be relatively slow. Not orc boar boys slow, but, well, let's just say that any light cavalry is going to be riding circles around them, because, well, they're riding barded war horses. These things should only move at max speed in the last bit of the charge, because if you keep running these heavy cavalry around, they're going to be exhausted very, 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 very quickly. And when they're exhausted, they should of course be ridiculously slow, to the point of being practically immobile.